everybody, Ben Woodruff here with another Falconry video. Today's video, I'm going to be talking about a fascinating group of falcons and how they're related. They're called hobby falcons. They're just called hobbies actually, but if you say, oh, I'm going to talk about hobbies, people think like, oh, like areas of interest, things that you do for fun with your free time. No, hobbies are a group of falcons. But I'm going to get into it. It gets really weird really fast. This is going to be a long form video, so long in fact that I'm going to break it up. So this is going to be a big long video, but I'm also going to do separate segments that I'm going to post each segment as a separate video as well. So you might be looking at one version of this, or you might be looking at the other. Also, before I start, if you haven't already, if you could hit subscribe, it very much helps me keep this channel up and running. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them, of course, at the bottom of the video, but also you can email me at benwoodruffalconry@gmail.com. Now, also, if you didn't know, I wrote a book called Trapping Essentials, and it sold out, and so now we got the new edition out. If you go to Western Sporting Publications, you can get a copy of this book if you want to learn about how trapping works in falconry. It's an illustrated guide that I wrote, and it's a very useful and helpful book, kind of showing how things are actually done. So let's get into this subject. I have been into falconry since I was a little kid, got into falconry, and peregrine falcons are what caught my attention. Like many other falconers, I read the book My Side of the Mountain, which is a story where a young boy runs away from home to go live off the land, and he learns about falconry, and he trains a falcon, and he uses that falcon to catch his dinner, to go out and catch prey that him and the bird can share. That opened my mind to the idea of falconry and got me into it. And of course, therefore, as with many young kids who get into falconry, the peregrine falcon was the king of the world, the most amazing falcon. And they really are. Peregrine falcons are incredible. Peregrine falcons live almost everywhere in the world. The word peregrine falcon means wanderer because they've traveled and migrated and expanded everywhere. And so in the falcons, there's a wide range of different groups of falcons, and there's the peregrines, which live absolutely everywhere, and then there's what's called the hierofalcons, which are saker falcons, gyr falcons, lanner falcons, and lagger falcons. As far as we can tell from genetic studies at this point in time, which is 2025, then these are the lanners, laggers, sakers, and gyrs are the closest to the ancestral lineage, and some genetics point specifically to the lanner falcon itself, that these gave rise to a lot of the big falcons. That being said, there is recent genetics also. I'm going to talk about this later on in this video, but also there is a falcon in Australia called the black falcon, and the black falcon genetically seems to also be from this lineage, from the hierofalcons. Well, those are the falcons that kind of captured my attention. And of course, the American kestrel. I grew up training and flying kestrels, and it was like a more colorful little version of a peregrine falcon, and that's what got me really excited, was to someday work with a peregrine falcon. Well, in my day, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have YouTube, and so there was a lot of research that was done through bookwork. You would read old books, and a lot of the old books had old European falconry, and that is where I first came into an understanding of the hobby. Hobbies are small falcons, and of course my interest was in falconry, not the birds themselves. I was interested in their history in falconry. And from what little I could find in books growing up, it said that medieval falconers, knights and stuff would use a goshawk because a goshawk was a good hunter, a good practical bird. And a lot of lords would use, peregrine falcons and gyr falcons, which were birds that took more time and effort. It wasn't as practical as a bird for a knight. It's like, hey, I have some free time, some leisure time. TV and the internet haven't been invented. I'm going to go fly a falcon and chase it and do my thing. Ladies were using merlins, is what I read in these books, that a merlin was a very athletic bird, but it was small, it was more diminutive, and kind of considered a more ladylike bird, a more feminine and ladylike bird that was still a proper hunting bird. But what about the hobbies? Hobbies were small, kind of similar in size to a merlin, bigger than an American kestrel. These hobbies, what I read from the books, were that they weren't very good for hunting. They were trained and they were kept, but they were, instead of being used for hunting, they were used for corralling. So a falconer would train a hobby and they would fly it around above sparrows, and the sparrows would get scared and would fly into a bush, and then the falconers would go over while the hobby was still flying overhead, and they would cast a net over it and reach in and grab all the sparrows. And then they would take them home and cook them up. Now, that seems weird eating a sparrow for dinner, but, medieval times, a whole plate full of roasted sparrows would be just like a bunch of tiny little Thanksgiving turkeys. And so I kind of dismissed hobbies. I didn't think much of them, and I never had much interest in them, and I never thought about what they might actually be related to. And now, just my mind is blown, actually, now that I have researched more and have learned so much more. So here's what I found out. So we're going to start off. We're going to go through all these species in the hobby lineage and the related species in the sister lineage. We're going to talk about these birds, and we're going to find out who's related to what, and it's going to surprise you. Some of them might really surprise you, but we have to start off with a baseline. So we're going to start off with the Eurasian Hobby. The Eurasian Hobby is, in my mind, because it's the first hobby that I ever learned about, is kind of the quintessential hobby. This is a bird that lives and breeds throughout Europe and Asia. It's got a very wide range. And as far as its coloration, as a young bird, it's kind of streaked, but as an adult, there's red flanks, these lower red flanks, and there's deep, thick streaks on top. And the bird itself has a head almost kind of like a peregrine falcon, has sort of a malar stripe, and it's an odd-looking bird. It has a dumpy face, and when I say that, I mean the bird itself looks like it ran into a wall, and the beak went and kind of got smushed in. It's kind of a stumpy face. Not only that, the eyes themselves are kind of turned upright. Any member of the hobby lineage, watch for that. Once you know it, you can't unsee it. Any hobby or hobby-related species, you'll see the head is different. And let's compare it. If you compare this to a peregrine falcon, so a peregrine falcon and a hobby kind of, from the side view, sort of kind of look the same, but when you see from the front, when you see those eyes turned up, the head is more turned up, the head is smushed down, and the beak is smushed in. They all have that kind of strange, dumpy face, and I'm going to point that out throughout this video. Even though hobbies, Eurasian hobbies, even though they live in Europe and Asia, they winter in Africa. So this is a long-range migrant bird. They weigh between about 175 grams to 285 grams. So this is, kind of, again, in the range of a merlin. But they're different than a merlin. A merlin is robust, it's thick-chested, and it has power. A merlin is the perfect bird for size because they're just small enough that they're buoyant, but they're big enough and burly enough to have huge power for long distance powered chases. A merlin is just like a little gyrfalcon. But not Eurasian hobbies. Eurasian hobbies have power, but they're way more buoyant and nimble and flighty, and they're able to do aerial acrobatics that other birds can't do. They have oversized primaries. So their primary wing feathers, they're longer than one would expect if you're comparing to like a gyrfalcon or a peregrine falcon or even a kestrel. They have these overly long, kind of swift-like primary feathers. And they use these in odd ways, in ways that are a bit more like how swifts and swallows fly and how they move. Now, their prey, they hunt a lot of birds, and they hunt a lot of insects, and a lot of dragonflies and butterflies, things like that. And they'll catch these on the wing. They'll catch them in the air. They don't like to target prey on the ground. They like to be on the move and catch things, and they will even sometimes eat some of these birds in the air. Now, it is interesting that again, when I was first reading about these birds back in the day, what I read made it seem like they were worthless for falconry. But I have since done more digging and have found that yes, these birds were in fact used as falconry birds. They were used to hunt larks, which is interesting because that's kind of the high mark. There's a bird called a skylark that merlins were used in medieval times to hunt. It's a very athletic, powerful, fast, tiny little bird, and merlins were great at it. Apparently, they apparently Eurasian hobbies were also used in medieval times for this same quarry, which is very impressive. But again, there's just a, how do you compare a Merlin compared to a hobby? A hobby is flighty and buoyant and woo, and a Merlin's like no. There's more power. If you saw a Merlin just on its own, you might think, okay, yeah, they're buoyant. Nah. Not compared to a hobby. Hobbies have a buoyancy and a nimbleness and an agility that's kind of unparalleled. The juveniles, again, they look like a little bit like a young peregrine falcon. They're kind of streaked, and even if you compare them, if you compare first year hobby to a first year peregrine, you might say, wow, these almost look like the same bird, just one's much bigger. But again, as adults, they get these deep red flanks, and they're sort of white and black on top and flanks on the bottom. Now remember that patterning, because once you see, again, this is a good starting point, because I want you to see these patterns in all the other birds we're going to talk about after this. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So remember, first year, kind of streaky, but then as an adult, red flanks and maybe kind of red rump feathers and red underneath the vent feathers, and kind of some deep barring here, and a very defined mallard stripe here. Watch for this, because you're going to see it on all the other birds that we're going to talk about in this video. But and again, if you're watching this video and you're wondering what is he talking about, this is just the hobby video, because I'm going to split this video up into other videos. So I will have a link to this to other birds that I'm going to mention in the other videos. So be watching for it. But anyways, Eurasian hobbies, kind of the basic quintessential starting point for this video, and really kind of an odd and amazing bird, not as used as much in falconry as Merlins, or even as kestrels for that matter. But they're really odd. Again, they're so, if you just look at these birds by their colors or something, you're gonna miss it. There's kestrels, there's hobbies, and there's Merlins. All three of these have cousins of different types. All three of these birds, they're very different from each other in how they are. So a kestrel hunts, and I'm talking Eurasian kestrels here, and all the old world kestrels are not as closely related to. Here we have American kestrels, and they're smaller and a bit different. But a Eurasian kestrel and any other old world kestrel, they're big, they're hefty in size, but they hunt like a red-tailed hawk. They can hover, they can be buoyant, they can hover in one place, and they can pursue, but basically they want to sit around and they want to dive down and catch a mouse or a vole or something like that. They will hunt birds, but that's not really what they're built to do. Merlins are built to just no, million miles an hour chase prey up to the size of a pigeon, which is pretty impressive. Well, really it's kind of in between with a hobby. A hobby is a buoyant falcon that can kind of just move and cut and tack and dive and chase, but it's not about power, it's about agility. So Merlins are very agile, kestrels are not very agile, hobbies are extremely agile, they're fast, but the speed is more about agility, the speed is not so much about power. So that's Eurasian hobbies. Beautiful birds, amazing birds, and one that I never thought much of, but truly a unique part of history, and again, one of these long-distance migrants. So I think they're very, very cool birds. The next bird we're going to talk about is the African hobby. The African hobby is in some ways quite similar to the Eurasian hobby, but first of all, it's smaller. It ranges throughout all of tropical Africa. It has pretty wide range, and it's adaptable, but it's smaller than a Eurasian hobby. The males are about 125 to 178 grams, and the females are about 186 grams to 224 grams. So there's a bit of a size range and difference. These birds normally hunt finches, swallows, and doves. And throughout Africa, there are these huge swarms of finches that will migrate in and migrate out. And they can just dive into these flocks and catch them with ease. They make it look very simple, but that's part of what they do. So this is a bird that does not hunt like a Merlin, it's more of a flash and dash. Merlins will do a direct pursuit and chase and work a whole flock. African hobbies do this as well, similar to similar to Merlins, but not with the same speed, but with more agility than a Merlin would. Oddly, now if you don't know this, falcons do not build nests at all. No falcon builds a nest. They'll do whatever. Some falcons will, like peregrine falcons, usually nest on a cliff ledge. Some falcons, small falcons, will nest in hollow trees, or they'll take over the old nest of another bird. Here in Utah, we have prairie falcons. Prairie falcons love to nest in old raven nests on the side of a cliff, and that works well for them. Well, African hobbies like to use the nests of black kites. Now, black kites are another species of bird of prey. They're much bigger than an African hobby. So sometimes African hobbies will just take over an old kite nest, but sometimes they will actually try to beat them to it. You know, some birds will use the same nest year after year, and if you can beat them to it and be aggressive enough and dive, keep them chased off, then you can kind of take over that nest. We don't know why that is. Some birds build nests, some don't at all. Falcons do not at all, and African hobbies are no exception. But again, they do like to target and use these nests of black kites. Now, the coloration patterning is similar to a Eurasian hobby. And again, in my long form video that I'm doing, that this is part of, that will already have Eurasian hobbies before this. But if you're watching this video as a separate thing just on African hobbies, then go ahead and check out the link down below, and you can see all the other hobbies that I'm talking about. So the coloration patterning is similar to a Eurasian hobby, which is first year birds are just kind of streaked, and then as adults they get deep patterning, deep coloration and patterning down below. But they have a much deeper, redder pigment than Eurasian hobbies or almost any other hobby. The brilliant, deep reds on adults, they're absolutely incredible. And these are one of these birds that are just kind of hit and miss. When we're talking about some of the other hobbies, some of them are colonial. They'll have a big old huge colonies, but not African hobbies. It's hit and miss if you see one. But again, this is a bird that is an active hunter of birds that almost exclusively hunts these smaller bird species. The next bird we're going to be talking about is the Oriental Hobby. The Oriental Hobby is another pretty standard looking hobby, but again, it's smaller than a Eurasian hobby. It lives in India, China, and Indonesia, and where it lives, it's got a wide range of food sources. Size-wise, this is a bird that is normally about 168 grams to 249 grams. Now that size range, remember with birds of prey, the females are always larger than the males. So it's a pretty small bird. Again, it's somewhat comparable in size to a merlin, but it's a much more buoyant bird than a merlin is. This is a very agile, very maneuverable bird. The first years, like most hobbies, are very streaked. They have long streaks on them, and then the adults turn a deep, ridiculously deep, intense, beautiful red. They hunt birds, and they hunt insects, and especially they hunt bats. Now, a lot of their range is very hot and very humid, which can be quite oppressive. And so one of the things that you have is that this is a species that is almost crepuscular. Crepuscular is nocturnal is when you hunt in the night. Diurnal is when you hunt in the day. Crepuscular is when you like to hunt at dawn and dusk. A little bit before and after dawn, a little bit before and after dusk. That is how the Oriental Hobby usually is. Now, part of that could be because that is when its prey comes out, because this is, again, an active bat hunter. But also, that could also be because of the hunting, because of the heat and the oppressiveness of the temperature. It's easier to do that when you have not such strong radiation from the sun hitting you. Now, part of why is this bird more colorful? You compare this bird to a Eurasian hobby. A Eurasian hobby has much less pigment. We don't know why this is. I did a video on why so many falcon species are orange, and maybe I'll put a link to that in this. But it's there. One of the things is there's something called Glauger's rule, kind of a dumb name. Glauger's rule finds that similar species, so if you have a species, the closer you get into equatorial and tropical environments, the deeper in red pigments it will get. Both the same species or also related species. And there's part of the theory as to why, when it comes to feathers, is pigmentless feathers are weaker and are more susceptible to damage and to rot from humidity. And so if you're in a tropical environment, having a heavily pigmented feather is a feather that is more likely to last without breaking. Now, of course, birds get a new set of feathers every year. They molt and get new feathers. But again, if you're tackling these oppressive humidity that you can sometimes have, then having deeper red is something you want. So again, we see this with the Oriental Hobby. We see this with the African Hobby. Some of these birds having this deeper red is, again, it's Glauger's rule is the biological term for it. And it is supposedly a way to have a stronger feather. But the Oriental Hobby is an absolutely beautiful bird, a gorgeous bird. Not the biggest of hobbies, but definitely one of the most beautiful ones. The next bird we're talking about is the Australian Hobby. The Australian Hobby is a really cool falcon. This is a bird that, being in Australia, you got to fill different roles. Australia is weird. It's kooky dook. It is nuts. And a lot of the species that have arisen there have had to fill roles, and you're doing it, I like to call this the Lego principle. If I give you a Lego kit and it's like, okay, you're going to make, an X-Wing fighter from Star Wars. It's an X-Wing fighter Lego kit. And I'm like, okay, now I want you to make a bus out of it. I'm like, whoa. Well, okay, I'm going to do the best I can with the parts I've got. That's what you have in Australia. You have ecological roles, ecological niches that are there where there's opportunity. There's a certain prey base, or there's a certain way of life available for an animal to fill. And the animal that fills it might not be what you would expect to do so. And so that is what you have with the Australian Hobby. The Australian Hobby lives in Australia, obviously, as the name says. It lives throughout Australia. It can be found most anywhere in Australia. But because it's in Australia, it's filling a different role than other hobbies elsewhere. Other hobbies are competing directly with things like merlins and other certain falcon species. So because of that, the Australian Hobby is big. It's 132 to 420 grams. Now, 420 grams, you're getting into the Cooper's Hawk range, that Cooper's Hawks we have here in the United States. These things get pretty big, especially for being a part of the hobby family, and considerably larger than other hobbies. But they're filling different roles than you would have. Again, they're going to be different. Everything in Australia is different. We're going to get into some fun birds in these videos, but this is a very active hunter. The juveniles are a darker rufous. They're a deeper, richer, darker color, and then the adults are still beautiful red, but a bit lighter. I love Australia so much, and I'm a painter, I'm an artist, and so I have a keen eye for pigments. And the birds, the raptors of Australia that get red, there is an angry, rich, rusty iron red. And so many cool Australian birds have that I love. And that is especially true, especially on the juvenile Australian hobbies. I love this particular hue, this pigment. Oh, it's just so rich and deep, and I love it. These are very active hunters. Now, this series of videos that I'm doing, I bring up the point that when I first learned about hobbies as a kid, I just totally dismissed them. I thought, they're just kind of dumpy birds. They're not very active hunters. It's not true. They are. These are aggressive, active hunters. The Australian hobbies, they hunt budgies, like parakeets, little budgies. There's big old huge flocks, and they love to chase these budgies and catch them, which is pretty impressive because these are very agile birds. They like to hunt and kill and eat bats, and there's a lot of bats in Australia. It's a great opportunity. They will hunt insects and eat them, including on the wing, which is what is expected with other hobby groups. But if you're up to 420 grams and you're hunting insects, That's pretty odd. But they will hunt birds, bats, and insects. All different kinds of birds, all different sizes. If you go online, you can just look up all kinds of videos and see what they'll hunt, and it's pretty impressive. Because again, if you're going from 132, you're like kind of male Merlin size, all the way up to 420 grams, you're getting into a Cooper's hawk size. This is an odd-sized bird, very unusual sized, but a really cool bird. I haven't been to Australia yet. Hope to someday. But I've had friends send me videos of these, and watching them just cut and slice through a whole flock of thousands of budgies flying all over, and they just... It's amazing to see. It's absolutely incredible to see. So the Australian Hobby is one of my absolute favorite members of the hobby lineage, and just so richly colored and so beautiful, and one of the most active hunters, because again, Australia provides opportunities for different types of hunting scenarios, and that's what they do. They will fill different roles that would normally be filled by Merlins. There are no Merlins in Australia. The next bird we're going to talk about is the Sooty falcon. The Sooty falcon is a really cool bird because it's dark. It's pigmented in a way that at first glance you would be understood to not think of it as being a member of the hobby lineage, but it is. This is a species that ranges across Southwest Asia and Northwest Africa. Now, it breeds on islands and coastal or desert cliffs. So it will target specific, cliffs that it will find, but it kind of likes to be isolated away from things and on these isolated cliffs. This is a long-distance migrant. Sooty falcons will winter in Madagascar and southern Africa and southeastern and South Africa. So that you're going from, Asia all the way down to Madagascar, basically, is where they like to be. That's long range, and a lot of members of these lineages that are related to the hobby family, they are weird long distance migrants. Now, this is a large bird for being a member of the hobby clan. They weigh 298 grams to 350 grams. So that's putting it substantially larger than most members of the hobby lineage. They have more musculature on their chest than other members of the hobby family because they are such long-distance migrants. They like to prey on dragonflies, all the way up to hunting birds as large as sand grouse, which is really kind of weird. Sand grouse are pretty hefty birds. So normally hobbies are thought of as just hunting little tiny migrating birds and insects. Well, if you're going to tackle prey as large as a sand grouse, you're kind of a sizable, substantial bird. And so they're gutsy. During the breeding season, they almost exclusively hunt other small birds. But in the off season, they'll range out. So they'll hunt more insects, and they'll hunt more reptiles, lizards, snakes. And oddly, it's been well documented that the Sooty falcon will hunt and eat small crabs. Seems very strange for a falcon. We normally think of falcons as being bird hunters, and to go to the extent of, wow, I'm going to hunt crabs seems kind of strange, but it's what they do. So the Sooty falcon, a very, very beautiful bird with rich, deep, dark coloration, and just nothing else quite like them. They're really beautiful, and again, one of my favorite falcons. The next bird we're talking about is the Eleonora's falcon. The Eleonora's falcon is another one of these long-distance migrant birds. Eleonora's falcons are very unique. They breed on islands in the Mediterranean. In fact, 2/3 of them nest in cliffs off the coast of Greece. They nest in colonies. This is not normal. Normally, raptors are very territorial. It's like you and your mate, and you're going to chase out anybody else. But these guys nest in loose colonies of up to 300 birds. It's very kind of strange that they would do that. You don't really have that kind of thing happening much elsewhere with raptors, but you do with the Eleonora's falcon. They're a long-distance migrant, so again, they're mostly in the Mediterranean in the breeding season, and then they will migrate south, and they winter almost exclusively in Madagascar. It's like, we're not going to stop somewhere else on the way. That's what they do. They have a delayed breeding season for their species. Normally, depending on where you are in the world, you're going to breed a certain time of year. But they key in on and have a later breeding season to key in on when little birds start their southern migration. So they want to make sure that there's a steady flow of small birds migrating past that they can catch and eat. Because normally if you just have an area and you're hunting, you're going to out hunt what is in that area. Well, if you have stuff migrating through, you again have a steady stream of food available. And so they capitalize off of these migrating birds. And it's a good system that works well for them. This is a larger member of the hobby family, quite a bit larger. They're 350 to 460 grams. So that's not huge, but again, that's getting into kind of the Cooper's hawk size range. You know, I'm an American falconer, and so Cooper's hawk is kind of a standard. It's too big to be little, too little to be big. That's kind of how the Eleonora's falcon is. But it's a typical member of the hobby family where it has ridiculously long, oversized primary feathers, a ridiculously long tail, and ridiculously long primaries. That makes it very nimble, very agile, maybe flying more like a swift or a swallow than a falcon, and gives them ability to migrate. And again, if you're going from the Mediterranean all the way to Madagascar every year, that's a long, long trip. The juveniles have a typical appearance that you see in members of the hobby family, where they kind of look like a passage or a first-year peregrine falcon. They just kind of have these light and dark brown streaks, and they're kind of bland and normal looking. Then as an adult, they have two different color morphs. There's a red morph that is more like hobbies, which they are a member of the hobby clan, with kind of the red flanks and kind of some of those colors. But they're more consistent and less streaked than hobbies, but you know, they are a type of hobby. But there's also a dark morph that's almost completely black. It's very interesting. This is not normal. You will have some range of color with falcons, but most falcons you don't have, like, there is a light morph and a dark morph. You don't normally have that with most falcon species by the numbers, but you do with the Eleonora's falcons. One of the oddest things about this species that has been documented is that Eleonora's falcons will trap birds. So they'll catch a bird, they'll bring it back to the nest, and they'll have areas, they'll kind of pluck the feathers off, and they'll shove the bird in basically what's a rock version of a cage. Now, there are people who question that, oh no, that wasn't really what was happening. But there are photos and it's well documented. They'll keep using the same spot again and again and again, where they'll take a bird, shove it in kind of a hole, and kind of put a couple of rock or two to kind of block it. And the bird itself has had most of its feathers plucked, so it can't fly away. And they use it as a meal to save for a later time. Now, of course, that is sad for the prey, but it's actually really ingenious thinking. We think of things, we as humans will store food for a later day. There's other animals, like rodents especially, will store grasses underground, like pikas will do that. Or you think of squirrels, gathering nuts or seeds and storing them underground for the winter. So you have this happening. But to have a bird do that, it's pretty impressive. Even if it's only waiting for a few days before it eats the meal, it's still an impressive thing. So the Eleonora's falcon, very strange in so many ways. It's an odd size. It's odd that it migrates. It's odd that it's a colonial species that nests in these big old huge colonies. It has a delayed breeding season, and the two color morphs that are very distinct. It's unusual, but a really cool bird. I love the Eleonora's falcon, and again, it's another one of my favorites. But it is a member of the hobby lineage. All right, the next bird we're going to talk about is the New Zealand falcon. Now, if you're watching just the video that I'm making on New Zealand falcons, cool. If you're watching the long form video where I'm going through all the members of the hobby lineage, now is when it starts to get weird. Everything I've talked about so far, the different members of the hobby lineage, it's like, okay, you can kind of see they're related. But now it's going to start to get weird. New Zealand falcons form a sister clade. They form a sister clade with themselves and with Aplomado falcons of the New World, which we'll get to next, and with Australian brown falcons. These are weirdos. They're weird, and they're very closely related. They are a branch off of the hobby lineage. You could call them hobbies if you wanted to, but these guys are weird, very strange. So let's go into the New Zealand falcon itself. The New Zealand falcon itself lives, of course, throughout New Zealand, as the name suggests. And again, genetics have shown that the closest relative of this bird is the Aplomado falcon, which is very strange because if you think of where New Zealand is and you think of where Aplomado falcons live, you know, from Mexico all the way on through South America, those are kind of odd, separated parts of the world, but genes don't lie. When we do genetic tests, genes don't lie. They always give us some direct answers. This is a large member of the hobby lineage. This bird weighs from 300 to 500 grams. And as with all falcons, of course, the males are smaller and the females are larger. We see with this, with the New Zealand falcon and with the next two, also with the Aplomados and the brown falcons, that they love to stay with their mate. They love to hang out with their mate year-round, not just in the breeding season. Most other falcons, when it's not breeding season, they ditch out their mate, and then you're just every man for himself, and then you come back together, you might mate for life, and if your mate's still alive when you come back, you start up a family again the next year. Not these guys. These guys stay together year-round, and they hunt together as a pair. And New Zealand is a strange place. New Zealand is very strange because it was ruled by birds and nothing but birds. There are mammals there now. Humans have brought mammals and introduced them. But for most all of New Zealand's history, the only mammals you have, I mean, there's some oceanic mammals like seals and stuff on the coast. And there's some species of bats in Australia that are almost entirely flightless. They go around on the ground hunting beetles, and they'll just perch hanging. They can barely fly. They can flutter a little because they don't have predators. And so it's just an easy way for them to hunt. Oh, well, New Zealand falcons will hunt those bats, but that's not the point. The point is the normal aerial predators weren't really there. There's not many raptors in New Zealand. There's a type of harrier called a swamp harrier. There is a species of owl. And there used to be the biggest eagle that ever lived, the Haast's eagle. That's a comparatively recent extinction. And the New Zealand falcon. And that's pretty much it. So this bird had the opportunity to kind of dominate a bunch of hunting roles. Same thing with the swamp harrier. The swamp harrier of New Zealand acts much more like a hawk than a harrier. It is much more of an aggressive hunter and has even been successfully used in falconry because, again, there is no waste in nature. So if you have opportunities being unfulfilled, animals start to change their behavior to adapt to take advantage of those kind of resources. And the New Zealand falcon, for coming from the hobby lineage, it is a pretty tough, versatile bird. And it can chase just about anything. So it hunts both native and non-native birds. There's been a lot of birds introduced, but it will also hunt a wide range of non-avian prey. It'll hunt hares and rabbits, which have been introduced, lizards, beetles, dragonflies, and oddly, it has been documented that this has hunted a type of penguin. Penguins! There's a penguin called a little blue penguin, and a little blue penguin weighs 975 grams. So that's like the weight of a male red-tailed hawk. So to have this 300 to 500 gram New Zealand falcon tackling prey that big, that's pretty impressive. So these birds will go after whatever they want. It's their territory now. They're the king of the world, especially with the Haast's eagles gone. They fill so many ecological roles. They're weird looking. They're cool looking. The first year birds are kind of modeled. And I'm an artist, so I'm always looking at pigments. And I always try to describe to people that there are pigments that you don't always see properly. Like you might say, oh, this is red, where actually there's some blue reflecting back at you. The New Zealand falcon is freaking green. You look at it, it's not, but start looking through enough pictures and you'll start to see green hues reflecting back at you. There's the actual colors, and then there's some reflected colors. And once you see it, you'll notice it. You're like, oh yeah, I'm kind of getting some green reflection back. A lot of birds in New Zealand are green, but that's you'll see it. So first year New Zealand falcons, they're deeper, they're darker, they're more subtle. And then once they get adult colors, they have more of that typical hobby falcon coloration or patterning. And again, if you look at Eurasian hobbies and you see Eurasian hobby and you see, okay, Eurasian hobby adult has that streaking on the chest and the red flanks and the red under the rump feathers, and you can see that. Oh yeah, you can see this is just a deeper, thicker, richer, more robust version. Every band is thicker, every stripe is thicker, the red is deeper, but it's all the same. So you can see this is just a giant hobby, and it probably came from Eurasian hobbies directly. We don't know. But again, its closest living relative is the Aplomado falcon. I think these are really cool birds in falconry. I've talked with falconers who have worked with them, captive bred New Zealand falcons, and apparently they're kind of a pain to work with. You have to get the weight management just right, and they're kind of cantankerous, and it's like, well, their closest living relative is an Aplomado, and when you hear all the good and the bad of an Aplomado, it lines up the same with the New Zealand falcon. They're very similar in those ways. So New Zealand falcons, really cool birds, very beautiful birds, very unique birds where they have just carved out. Them and brown falcons, which I'll get to in a bit, they have kind of taken over and tackled so much more. And they fill in different roles. So in other words, if you're looking at a bird, you're looking at its size, its shape, and you might be like, okay, yeah, it's a standard falcon, but there's subtle differences. The density of certain bones, the length of certain toe bones, the width of their eyes, certain things that are different because this is a bird that is adapted for New Zealand when nobody else was fighting them for the territory. Other than swamp harriers, they had it all. And they have done great filling every single role. And again, to show how adaptable they are, like, it's only, a few hundred years that mammals have been there, and they're like, oh, you got rabbits, you got hares, okay, we're going to tackle them. And they go after them. That's pretty amazing. They'll just jump onto a new prey source like that quick, that they've never seen before. Again, New Zealand falcons, who knows how many millions of years they've been there, who knows, but they didn't have mammals there, and now, within a couple hundred years, mammals, okay, we'll hunt them. So New Zealand falcon is highly adaptable, highly successful, not the most agreeable bird to work with for falconry, but a lot of fun. From everybody I talked to, they're a lot of fun to fly and a lot of train and to work with. So really an exciting bird. I've never worked with one myself, but I hope I get to someday because they are one of the coolest falcons on Earth. The next bird I'm talking about is the Aplomado falcon. Aplomado falcons are one of the most strikingly beautiful birds that you'll ever see. They live in southern North America, on down throughout Mexico, Central America, South America, all the way down to Argentina. Now, this is a kind of a medium-sized bird. They can be from about 308 grams to about 460 grams. So that's putting them really in the size range of a Cooper's hawk. And again, I always say this, a Cooper's hawk is too big to be little, too little to be big. Same thing with an Aplomado falcon. And it really, in a lot of ways, fills a falcon role of a Cooper's hawk. But this is a bird with a rich history, both with humans and in the wild. And it's one of the most striking, beautiful birds on Earth. There's a range, and there's normally kind of 2 or 3 subspecies recognized depending on who you talk to. There's the northern Aplomado, and then the ones we have in the United States. Let me rephrase that. The ones that we have access to for falconry and for wildlife education in the United States are Peruvian, that have been imported. And because they were recognized as a separate subspecies, we were allowed to have them brought in and to be able to be captive bred and be used in falconry. Peruvian Aplomado falcons are much richer and deeper in color than the Aplomado falcons we have native here in the United States. So let's talk about these a little bit here. Aplomado falcons in the north, they have kind of, again, the typical markings of a hobby where the first year they're kind of bland, and then they get, as an adult, more reddish on their flanks, and then they get kind of white on top, and those streaks leave. Depending on where you're at, that can be richer and richer and richer. And again, the further south you go, the more rich the red gets until it doesn't matter. They don't have white on the top as an adult. So the whole thing is red. And again, in birds, we call that Glauger's rule. Glauger's rule is once you get closer to the equator where you have harsher sunlight, breaking down the collagens in feathers. The keratins are in feathers. And you also might have humidity that could also be breaking things down. Then having deeper pigments reflect back more sunlight, and they're able to retain rigidity and structural integrity. So, according to Glogger's rule, it makes sense that, again, the closer you get to the equator and the closer you get to the tropics with the Aplomados, the richer and deeper, more colorful they are. Where the further north you get, where, again, the very end of the northern part of the range, where you have them just kind of like in southern Texas and bits of Arizona, bits in New Mexico, they're quite pale by comparison, much more pale, because you're much farther north. This is a really cool bird in its history, because it has a history in kind of Shakespearean times. During the times of Shakespeare, Aplomado falcons were imported by the Spanish, and they were kept by royalty and mated around the royal courts of Spain, Portugal, and France. Now, the people who kept these called them elite falcons, and they were used to hunt doves and pigeons and Hungarian partridges, which is pretty neat. Now, this brings up a very interesting point. We have documents of them, we have drawings, we have paintings, people holding them. I cannot express how odd this is, because keeping a bird of prey alive takes work. It is hard. It takes effort. And you have to have fresh food every day, and the food can go bad easily, or you have to have live food for it. So how on earth are you bringing Aplomado falcons from the New World back over to Shakespearean Europe and keeping them alive? Furthermore, how are they acquired? And furthermore, how are they cared for? It's not like in that level of maritime history that people were bringing falconers over. Let's bring falconers over to the New World to bring some falcons. It's not going to happen. It is very likely that the Aztec Empire did have some level, if not falconry, at least ceremonial keeping of birds with certain amounts of husbandry, jesses or anklets of some kind, in order to be able to have the birds available and have, knowledge of how to get them back across the seas. I just think it's absolutely incredible. I have a video on this, and I will put a link down below to this, but really addressing this in greater depth. But there is a rich history that's a little snippet of history during Shakespearean times, and I think it should be talked about a lot more, because it does indicate the possibility that indeed you may have had, falconry of some sort in the New World, and that would be really exciting to know. We do know that these birds are really good for abatement. They can handle the extreme of heat, and because they like to hunt as a pair, they just like to have fun. So they're not just motivated by food, they're motivated by hanging out with their mates. So if you raise them from a baby and you're flying them, they're really good to help, and they're used extensively for abatement. Which abatement is, if you are running, for example, you got a vineyard or you got some sort of crops you're growing, and there's all these birds that want to come in and eat them, well, you just go and fly a pair of Aplomado falcons, and they will keep chasing off the birds from the vineyard. So sometimes they'll catch some of them, but just even the chase helps keep them away and keeps your vineyard or your crop secure. So in the modern era of falconry, abatement using Aplomado falcons has revolutionized things here in the New World. They're kind of a perfect species for it, because most birds of prey are pretty lethargic in the summer. They don't like to deal with the heat, but Aplomados can just get up and go and do their thing, and I think they're wonderful. I've flown several Aplomados. I've flown both northern and southern, which is not usual. Normally you can't have access to one, but I got from the Peregrine Fund an old retired breeder, and that was from a northern Aplomado, and I found her to be much easier to work with than the Peruvian Aplomados I had flown before. So that's just been my personal experience. But they're so strikingly beautiful, so colorful, and their markings are so distinct. But again, they're from the hobby lineage, and so because they're a type of hobby, then you can see it. You can see the pattern. You can see the black. You can see the red flanks. You can see the markings. Like, okay, this is a nuanced, diverged lineage off of hobbies, but you can see it's a giant New World hobby, and that is what they are. That kind of bothers me. I don't know why. Because I just never thought of them that way. I just thought of them as these cool, weird thing. And it's strange that they came from that lineage, but genetics don't lie, and neither do our eyes, and they are from the hobby lineage. So that's Aplomado falcons. Again, I think they're really cool. I have videos going into greater depth on Aplomados, but again, this is just to be part of my bigger hobby video. So love them to death, and if you ever get a chance to work with one, I hope you take that opportunity, but just know they are very different from working with any other falcon except for New Zealand falcons, of which they are very comparable and highly closely related to. The next falcon we're talking about is the Australian brown falcon. The Australian brown falcon is a really cool, very strange species. Now again, it is a branch off of the hobby lineage, which it doesn't look like it at first. It looks brown, and it doesn't seem to have any of the colorations you would have of a hobby, but genetics don't lie, and the genes say that the Australian brown falcon, the Aplomado falcon of the New World, and the New Zealand falcon form kind of a sister clade. These three species branched off of hobbies together and then became what they are now. Australian brown falcons, Australia's weird. And Australia gives the opportunity for species to adapt in strange ways. There is no waste in nature, and so, as I've said on other videos before, if you have a resource, then a species coming in that is not particularly suited to hunting that, but nobody else is taking advantage of that resource, will adapt to be able to do so. And the brown falcon is that way. So two things. First of all, Australia is kooky dook. It's weird. It's got all kinds of strange animals and strange opportunities and strange resources. But also, the landscape itself has radically changed. It didn't all used to be desert. That has happened, geologically speaking, very recently. And as it has become more arid, and basically the coastal areas of Australia have become as such, then you have new opportunities that show up. We have bone records of certain animals that were, tree dwellers. You find their bones in caves of like Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion. This is a species that we see, in the middle of Australia, in the middle of nowhere. There's no plants, there's nothing, it's just flat desert. And there's these bones from 10,000 years ago when it used to have trees. So landscapes change, things change. And if the rule of nature is adapt or go extinct. And the brown falcon is a master of adaptation. Now, this species lives throughout Australia, but also Tasmania, and also in Papua New Guinea. A little bit. And so it has a wide range. If you have deserts, you have mountains, you have extreme cold temperatures, and even snow once you're getting into Tasmania. But then, you get the tropics in Papua New Guinea. So this is a falcon that covers a lot of range. Now, talking to one of my friends, Angus, in Australia, he tells me that these are, in one sense, similar to a red-tailed hawk. Meaning, in the United States, you can't go anywhere without seeing a red-tailed hawk. They're everywhere. They're highly adaptable. Now, red-tailed hawk is a boodio. It's a buzzard. We call them hawks here in America, but it's not a hawk. The rest of the world would say a red-tailed buzzard. Budios, buzzards, red-tails are soaring hawks. They're not at all closely related to brown falcons. However, they fill the same role. So if you are adaptable, if you're a generalist, you're going to thrive. And red tails have thrived, and so have brown falcons. And so apparently brown falcons are just about everywhere. They're very tolerant of humans. Now, this is a sizable bird. These range from 430 grams to 860 grams. So that's getting into the range of what I would consider big falcon range. I consider, like a peregrine falcon, a lanner falcon, a saker. Those are big falcons. This is getting into that big range. The upper end of a female, you're starting to get into that size range. And that's pretty substantial. They're really adaptable, and they will hunt anything. They'll hunt small mammals. They'll hunt birds. They eat a lot of snakes, including venomous snakes. They hunt lizards, and they will chase insects around on the ground. That's been well documented. They'll just chase and scurry and go after things on the ground. They have a wide range of color morphs, a huge range, from almost as black as the Australian black falcon, which I'll mention coming up. Almost that dark. So you gotta be able to tell the difference. But this is a bird with very long legs, a very long tail, very long wings, and it's such an Australian bird. Angus has sent me some video clips, hearing the calls of some of these and seeing where they'll nest just right on a building, or where they'll nest right just in a cluster of rocks by the ground, and it's wild. It's wild, and the sound they make. Yeah, I have never, ever heard a falcon make these sounds before. Anything like this. These sounds, to me, sound very similar to caracaras. Now, caracaras are a way distant branch off that branched off from falcons a long time ago. The crested caracara is probably the most famous, in my opinion, the prettiest of all the caracaras. But some of the caracaras make sounds very similar to the Australian brown falcon. So that might just be convergent evolution, or it could be some deep ancestral connection that's still there. This is a really beautiful bird and really adaptable. It likes to hang out just about everywhere. But again, the strange thing about it is how closely related it is to Aplomado falcons and New Zealand falcons, which all three of these species are separated by vast distances, and yet still genetics don't lie. This is one of the coolest falcons on Earth. I think it's probably, if you were in Australia, it's probably one of the most boring. It's probably kind of like, it's another brown falcon. But for me, being a guy for here in the United States, I just see them and find them absolutely fascinating. They fill so many roles. They fill the roles of what a buzzard would be. They really do. And yet they're a falcon. But they're much more nimble. Even though they're a falcon, they don't come from a lineage like peregrines or sakers or something more proper falcons. They come from the hobby lineage. So it's like an enormous sized hobby that is also filling the ecological roles of like red-tailed hawks or Swainson's hawks. So they're really cool. So they will hunt birds, but they do hunt a lot of other ground quarry as well. It seems like they're trying to just pick up anywhere there's food, they can go after it. One of the coolest species of falcons on Earth, and one of, if not, they probably are, other than perhaps gyrfalcons, they probably have the widest variation of colors. Because usually, you see a prairie falcon, you're going to kind of get a prairie falcon. You see a peregrine, there's a little bit of range of coloration variation within a subspecies. Kestrels, you get a little bit of a range, but brown falcons, all over the place, from almost pure black to super pale like a prairie falcon, everything in between. You don't get that with other falcons, but you do with the brown falcon. So one of my favorite falcons on Earth, and it's a cool one to talk about. So hope you enjoyed talking about brown falcons. The next bird I'm going to talk about is the black falcon. Now, the black falcon shouldn't belong on this list. This is a video I'm doing on hobbies and falcons that have branched off from the hobby lineage. Black falcons, it doesn't seem that they did, but it would be easy to mistake that. If you think about Australia, so the big falcons, like there's the brown falcon and there's the gray falcon, which I'm not covering in this video. And then there's the black falcon. And they all kind of seem, black, brown, and gray. You're probably really closely related. Now, I think that Australian gray falcons are an early branch off from peregrine falcons. But I'm not getting into that in this video because I'm already going off beat by talking about black falcons. Black falcons have a lot of traits that would make you think. Now, they live throughout Australia. They have a pretty broad range. And again, this is a sizable bird. They're 582 grams to 833 grams, so that's a pretty sizable falcon. Again, not huge, but sizable. That's bigger than you would expect for something related to hobbies. They are hobby-like in that they do have longer primaries than one would expect for a falcon of their size, a longer tail than one would expect for a falcon of their size. However, genetic testing seems to indicate that this species is an early offshoot from the hierofalcons. Now, the hierofalcons are sacred falcons, gyr falcons, lanner falcons, and lagger falcons. So, and with some genetics seem to suggest that the lanner falcon is kind of the proto-falcon that all the big falcons came from. But genetics seem to show that we should add the Australian black falcon should be part of that clade. So that the hierofalcons should probably be, according to genetics, gyr falcon, sacred falcon, lanner falcon, lagger falcon, Australian black falcon. Once you know that, if you look at enough markings, if you look at enough images of sacred falcons, and then you start looking at a black falcon, you'll start to say, oh, okay, you can kind of see the proportion, you can see there. But again, adapted for a highly arid and ever-changing environment that is Australia. But I gotta mention it in this video just because sometimes books will lump them together. They're like, oh, well, what are the three falcons of big falcons of Australia outside of the peregrine? Because there are peregrines in Australia. But it's like, oh, the black falcon, the brown falcon, and the gray falcon. But all three of them seem to be from very different lineages, and the coloration just seems to be similar. But worth mentioning in this video because they do have hobby-like traits. Their build in some ways is kind of hobby-like, but genetics seem to indicate otherwise. The next falcon we're talking about is the bat falcon. The bat falcon is gorgeous. Gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. They live in Mexico, Central America, and South America. And they're small. These are little birds. They are 108 grams to 242 grams. They branched off, genetics show they branched off from the hobby lineage, and you can see it. Hobby falcons, one of the things I always say, hobbies have a face that looks like they ran into a wall. Their beak is more blunted in. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And also, from a front view, they have that hobby-shaped face where the eyes are up a little too high and the face is a little smushed down. You come from that hobby lineage, you have that. So they come from that line, but oh, they look so New World. Their coloration is so rich and so thick. They have just these amazing colors. But I'll get to that in a second. They hunt birds, and they hunt bats, and they hunt insects. So pretty standard hobby falcon in that sense. And you can see, if you see the patterning, you're like, okay, yeah, you can see, again, like any member of the hobby lineage, have those red flanks, kind of have that on the adults, the dark in the chest, and kind of lighter up top, smushed face, and kind of well-defined here on the cheeks. Now, when they're young, it's different. When they're young, the colorations are more muted. And then they get the vibrant colors as an adult. But as an adult, it's just a really rich, distinct, vibrant, thick, well-defined color morph version of a hobby. They're not as wispy as a hobby. They are, if you look at their wingspan, you can still see hobbies all have those kind of dinky primaries where the individual primary feathers themselves are narrower and longer and more swift. Like, you do have that. But overall, it's a more compact bird for its size. They seem to fill a very similar role specifically to the Oriental Hobby. The Oriental Hobby and how it hunts and when it hunts. Bat falcons are very similar in that bat falcons are somewhat crepuscular, which means you have diurnal animals, that's daytime, nocturnal is night. Crepuscular is you like to go a few hours before and after dawn and a few hours before and after dusk. They love to hunt bats. It's one of their absolute favorite things. And in the tropics where they live, there are an awful lot of bats. And of course, one of their favorite places to roost and to nest is on giant Mesoamerican ruins, like Mayan ruins, like Tikal is one where there's nesting pairs in it. Chichen Itza. There's these nest sites. A lot of times they'll just take, because a lot of these Mayan ruins, it's like they're these big towering places and they're overlooking open ground. That open ground gives way for things like insects, and the insects are going to get hunted by the bats. And so you just nest up there on top of these ruins and you just fly out and catch bats that are hunting insects. So it just draws them in. It's kind of really interesting in that way. Now, I'm going to bring just up as a side point too. There's two birds that in Mayan lore that are always kind of brought up, and that is the laughing falcon and the bat falcon. The laughing falcon is the messenger of the gods, and so this is a bird that also frequents Mayan ruins because the open areas near these ruins bring in rodents, which bring in snakes, which brings in laughing falcons, because laughing falcons like to hunt snakes. Now, for ancient Mayan lore, the laughing falcon is the messenger of the gods. And so, it's laughing, the calls it makes. It's kind of an interesting bird. So that's kind of a side point, but I think it's interesting to bring it up. I haven't been down to Mesoamerican ruins. I want to desperately. I would love to go to Tikal or Chichen Itza. But one of the things, if you ever get the chance, keep an eye out for the bat falcons. They're almost always on the top of the temples, nesting or at least hunting from those vantage points. And again, at the edge of the big flat areas right in front of ruins, you can often find laughing falcons sitting there hunting. So, good thing to watch for. Bat falcons are so beautiful and so little. They're tiny, but they're really cool. I haven't gotten a chance to work with them. I'd love to someday. But again, I never would have made the connection of thinking them as being related to hobbies. But once you know it, and once you know the patterns on a Eurasian hobby, and how, where the patterns and where things grow, you can see it's just a much more defined and dense and deeply, richly pigmented version of a hobby. And that's pretty cool and pretty wild. So that is the bat falcon. The next falcon I'm going to talk about is one that I never ever would have thought could at all possibly be related to the hobbies, and that is the Orange Breasted Falcon. The Orange Breasted Falcon is a big bird. This is a big falcon, a big proper falcon. They live in Mexico, Central America, and on through South America. They're kind of rare compared to a lot of the other hobbies, but they're big. They're 325 grams to 700 grams. So they're getting kind of into the range of a small peregrine, like a male peregrine. But these things are weird. Coloration-wise, they look like a bat falcon. Sometimes people mix them up, which if you see them side by side, there's no contest. It's like totally different. From certain angles, the head looks like a peregrine's head. And that's why I never ever would have thought that they could have been related to the hobbies and to a bat falcon. It was deemed as being convergent evolution, right? You have certain birds, certain ways of life, developing certain coloration patterns that are just happen to be similar, right? Or you could say something like, well, if an orange-breasted falcon is so much bigger, that if a bat falcon has the same coloration as a much bigger, more dangerous bird, it'll get left alone. That's a valid possibility. But some of the genetic testing seems to indicate that the orange-breasted falcon is basically the king of the hobbies, which is weird to think of them as being a hobby falcon. This is what it's like. Think of rodents. If you name some rodents, like you got mice, and you got ground squirrels, and you've got tree squirrels, and you got all these different rodents, and some are kind of bigger and smaller. And then in South America, you have a capybara. It's like, what the? This thing's like as big as a pig. It's a rodent? What? It's nuts. That's what the orange-breasted falcon is like. It's like you got all these other members of the hobby family, the Eurasian Hobby, the New Zealand falcon, the Oriental Hobby, the bat falcon.
And then you have the orange-breasted falcon. Hello, guys. I'm part of the hobby lineage.
No, you can't be.
Yes, I am.
It's like, that's just absolutely wild to me. I don't know if that's entirely true. Genetics are still out, but it does seem to be the case. And that really kind of throws me off because a bird this big and this specialized seems strange. This falcon, I think it could be in contest for being the most beautiful falcon on Earth. Striking, beautiful, well-defined, gorgeous. And falcons are known among raptors as having long toes, really big feet. The peregrine falcon is normally considered to have the largest feet of any falcon. And peregrine falcons, when they stretch them out like this, they do have enormous feet. Well, It's beaten out by the Orange Breasted Falcon. For its size, the Orange Breasted Falcon has the biggest feet, the longest toes of any falcon. And why do that? Well, what do they hunt? I mean, they hunt a wide range of birds and bats. They do hunt a lot of bats, but they will hunt parrots. And if you're going to tackle a large parrot, you've got to be able to subdue them quickly so they don't turn around and bite off your toe. So that might be why they have such big toes. But again, they also hunt bats, and you don't need to be 700 grams to hunt bats, because bat falcons themselves, their closest relative, can be 108 grams and still catch bats. So for whatever reason, these guys are huge. But here's the strange thing. Orange-breasted falcons hunt a lot of bats. Well, turns out bats also hunt them. We set up a game camera on a nest of an orange-breasted falcon, and in the daytime, right at sunset, you had them catching bats and bringing them back to the nest and feeding their babies bats. And once they went to sleep, on the game cam, it was documented that vampire bats came in and were biting and feeding off of the female as she was sitting on the young. So that's kind of weird, kind of creepy, kind of wild to think about, but that's the case. They eat bats, and bats also eat them. It's pretty nuts. Bats also have a rich history in Mayan culture. So does the orange-breasted falcon. They both figure prominently in the art in Mesoamerica, but the coloration changes. So most members of the hobby family, including the orange-breasted falcon, their first-year colors are kind of muted and they get bright and more vibrant as adults. Well, even a juvenile orange-breasted falcon is quite rich in its coloration, but then once they do turn adult, boy, they absolutely glow. And the reds, the colorations are just so gorgeous, so beautiful. So the orange-breasted falcon, I've gotten a little bit of a chance to work with them at the Peregrine Fund up in Idaho. And boy, they were amazing birds, absolutely amazing birds to work with. I wish we had access to use them in properly in falconry, or even to do some hybrids, but just as their own, they are amazing birds. They do need our help. They seem to be rare, where bat falcons seem to adapt everywhere. They just whatever, very similar to hobbies. But orange-breasted falcons seem to have a specific set of needs that are not easily met everywhere. So they do require our protection and our help. And again, I think they are maybe one of the top 3 most beautiful falcons on the planet. So love orange-breasted falcons. Was shocked to find out that they seem to be the king of the hobby lineage, but absolutely fascinating birds, and I was happy to talk about them in this video. And I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about them. The next bird we're going to talk about is the red-footed falcon. The red-footed falcon is one of these extreme migrants. They live in Southeast Asia, and then they migrate throughout all of Africa. Their size, they're pretty small. They weigh 130 to 200 grams. So that's kind of, kestrel to very small merlin kind of size range. They're not very big, and they're very buoyant. But these are part of a sister clade. These guys are not true members of the hobby lineage, but they might be. We don't know. So these guys fit somewhere in between hobbies and kestrels. Hobby falcons, which we've gone over in the rest of the video. Red-footed falcons, they're just kind of in between that. So that's why I'm including them, because they form a sister lineage. So these guys migrate. They're really beautiful birds. They hunt insects, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. They're just kind of an all-around bird. They'll just kind of do whatever. The juveniles are streaked, and then the adults, they are sexually dimorphic. The adult males are a very distinct, very beautiful blue-gray with bright red feet, and the adult females have a bluish back, and they kind of have a creamy chest. And again, genetically, these are somewhere between kestrels and hobbies. So they're kind of an interesting bird. We don't fully know. And again, the more we sequence genomes, the more we can find out where they fit in and when they diverged off. But they don't quite fit into the hobby lineage, but they don't quite fit into kestrels. They're kind of somewhere in between, and that's why they're worth including. Now, they used to be considered a subspecies, one and the same with the next falcon, and now they're separate species, and that is the Amur falcon. The Amur falcon breeds in Eastern Asia and Northern Mongolia and North Korea. That's where they breed, but they migrate south to Southern Africa. That is a long range. It's like 9,000 miles. These incredible migration routes. These guys are even smaller than red-footed falcons. On average, they're 97 grams to 188 grams. So remember, the red-footed are 130 to 200 grams. So they're a little smaller. They catch insects and birds on the wing. So they don't like to catch things on the ground. They like to catch things on the wing. And they're kind of different. The males are kind of dark in their coloration, talking about a dark blue, and the females are a blue-black on the back, and they've got a mottled chest where it's a little different. It's similar to the red-footed falcon, but a little bit different, and a little more mottled on the chest. These are known for their mass migrations. These birds mass in, just countless numbers of these birds migrating together at the same time. What's really sad about this is there is no waste in nature, and technically we're part of nature. So entrepreneuring humans said, well, hey, there's all these birds migrating through. Let's catch them in mass. And so they'd set out net traps and would catch thousands and thousands and thousands of them to eat for food, for the food market. So they'd catch them alive and they'd just tie them, and the birds are just hanging there. They bring them into market and kill them and cook them up like tiny little Thanksgiving turkeys. There's not much meat. Again, a big female is 188 grams, and a lot of that is feather and bone and guts. So the amount of meat, a gram is about the weight of a raisin. So if you're looking at like maybe 50 grams worth of meat tops, 40, 50 grams tops, that's not a lot. But these things were being killed in mass. It was one of the good stories. Normally these stories all end up sad. This came out publicly. People were just doing this for generations, thought nothing of it, and their numbers were starting to plummet. Well, when this was noted, people around the world said, well, hey, whoa, let's not do this. Let's act protection. And so this is a great effort that the countries where this was happening at have said, hey, let's step in and let's make it illegal to kill these birds, but also let's educate the kids and the children and the people. Let's go around to the villages and explain, hey, look, these are these falcons. Please do not trap them. Please do not eat them. Please do not kill them. And it's totally shifted things. So the Amur falcon is a very recent success story of what we can do to try to kind of help things and get things going better. And that kind of makes me happy to hear. But the Amur falcon is a very strange one. Again, such ridiculously far migration routes. We don't know why they do it, but most birds that have wackadoodle migration routes like that, we know that migration route started during the Ice Age, and depending on what geologic barriers and what ice sheets were there, they kind of determined where things go, and now it's just a genetic memory to go a certain way, and you still go even if it transcends logic to travel so far. But that is the Amur falcon. The last bird on this video is the Taita falcon. The Taita falcon is one of my favorite falcons, and I've had the chance for the past 2 years to work with my own Taita falcon, Rahara. She is a retired breeder and couldn't look any further from hobbies. If you're watching this video, I've done other videos on Taita falcons, and I'll put a link down below where you can watch the actual video, the breakdown I do on Taita falcons in depth. But Taita falcons are really strange. They are the most specialized falcon in the world, and genetics seem to show that they are the most recent falcon in the world. They're everything a hobby shouldn't be. They're stumpy, they're barrel-chested, they're dense, they're not buoyant. They're all about, they're huge, muscular, built for speed, and they just live next to waterfalls. They live in Africa, next to waterfalls, and they want to sit up there and wait for swift swallows, bats to fly out, and they'll dive down and catch them and let their momentum carry them. They're so dense, and their wings are so undersized that if they're 30, 20 grams overweight, they literally cannot fly. They can glide and let the updrafts from a waterfall carry them back up, but they literally cannot fly. That's how over-muscled and underwing sized they are. That couldn't be further from a hobby. Hobbies are the exact opposite. Ridiculously oversized primaries, ridiculously oversized tail, very buoyant, not a super strong flyer, very narrow chest, very narrow musculature in the chest. But you know what? I've read that some people try to classify them in with hobbies. And I got thinking about it, and there are similarities. All hobbies have a beak that looks like they ran into a wall and eyes that are kind of upright. Well, Taita falcons, their eyes are not up in a weird way, but their beak is kind of snub-faced. Their primaries are not oversized, but they are extremely narrow. Each individual primary feather is much narrower than it should be for its size, which is a hobby trait. They do have certain coloration that is reminiscent of things, for example, an African hobby. So some people have suggested that, and it is a valid suggestion. However, a genetic study has shown that Taita falcons derive directly from peregrines and are in fact so closely related to peregrine falcons that they technically could just be considered a subspecies of peregrine, just a tiny peregrine. So I'm torn on this. I'm hoping more genetic studies are going to come out. Again, genetics don't lie. It does seem that the Taita falcon is a type of peregrine falcon. But then how interesting that in a comparatively short period of time, the Taita falcon is adapted to have more hobby-like traits. Again, like the snub face, the coloration, the very narrow primary feathers. It's very strange. So, the verdict is still out of my book. Right now I'm going with the genetic testing we do have, which does seem to indicate that the Taita falcon is a branch off of the peregrine falcon, and they've even been crossed with peregrine falcons. I know Pete Jungerman has crossed Barbary peregrines with them successfully with no problem whatsoever. So if you have that kind of genetics happening just fine, it will be a lot harder to cross a member of the hobby family with a peregrine because they're branched off way earlier. So I think it's an issue of convergent evolution. I think the reason that Taita falcons have some hobby characteristics is strictly convergent evolution, where two unrelated species develop similar traits due to a similar way of life. That's what I think is what's going on here. But the verdict's still out. This video is being made in 2025. We will see in coming years what more genetic testing tells us, and I will update what I find out. But I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed learning about all these different hobbies and the sister lineages, and this is just such a strange family. All the hobbies, they're so unique, they're so weird. But I had no idea how many of these were related to each other. I grew up just thinking an Eleonora's falcon was just an Eleonora's falcon. I didn't think anything of it. I didn't think, some of these, a Sooty falcon, it's just a Sooty falcon. A gray, brown falcon, who knows? It's just, I had no idea that all these things were so closely related. So it's been fun for me to do a deep dive and to talk to certain falconers and wildlife biologists around the world and get more information on these birds. And I hope you enjoyed learning more about them, because I think it's good to know about the birds themselves and to learn where they came from. If you like this video, if you'd be willing to hit subscribe, I very much appreciate it. If you have any questions, you have any comments, or you want to share or collaborate on any videos, again, you can email me at benwoodruffalconry@gmail.com. And I hope you enjoyed the video. And as always, happy hawking.